If you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and start turning to Luke chapter 6. And I will see if I'm having the same tech issues. Nope, it's all going to work out here just fine. I'm going to start with what will appear to be a very simple and perhaps even silly question. And the question is, can we actually do what Jesus teaches? Some people will automatically say, of course, and I'm going to prove it. When I think of this, I think of a guy named Leo Tolstoy who became a Christian through a dramatic experience, and he took everything Jesus said very, very seriously. He had several slaves, what they called serfs, that he immediately let go. He put all of his property up for sale. In fact, gave away much of his property. He took his copyrights to all of his books and gave that all away. He started wearing kind of beggar's clothes and even found himself making his own shoes. And he said everything that Jesus says that he would do. The problem was that Tolstoy decided to do it in a very public way, and he, as a matter of fact, could not do everything that Jesus had taught to do. He found himself overwhelmed and burdened. He had a friend who was critiquing his presumption that he could actually do what Jesus taught. And he wrote to that friend, "It is true that I have not fulfilled a thousandth part of the teachings of Christ. I am ashamed of this, and I have failed to fulfill them, not because I did not wish to, but because I was unable to." When Tolstoy died, another writer said of his experience that he was like a spawning salmon. He fought upstream all of his life, at the end collapsing from moral exhaustion. And so some will look at Tolstoy and his approach and say, those who think they can do what Jesus teaches probably should just wave the flag right now and give up on that endeavor. I think of someone more contemporary who, like Tolstoy, was sitting in these very pews, an elderly man who had spent most of his life sitting in these pews, saying words that I will always remember. I hope I've done enough. The Tolstoy exhaustion of trying to do and fulfill the commandments of Jesus and thereby hope in it. And so some, instead of saying, yes, in fact, we can do the teachings of Jesus, will say, of course, we cannot do what Jesus is teaching. Martin Luther, in his well-known interpretation of whether it be the Sermon on the Mount, that being Matthew, or the Sermon on the Plain, that being Luke, has said that the Sermon on the Mount has one function. You are to read it and get the sense as you read it, there's no possible way I could do any of this. And Luther says when you get to that place where you say, I can't do any of this, then Luther says that's exactly where you need to be. And so in Luther's idea or notion of following Jesus' teachings, Luther is saying when you look in the mirror and you see the wretch in the mirror that is you, what you need to do is you need to learn to live with that wretch, because the wretch is going to be there for your entire life. And there's nothing in this world or in the next that will do anything about it. And so then following Jesus is much like a factory that produces get-out-of-jail cards, and you just know every time you see the wretch, you have to just give another one of those get-out-of-jail cards, because there really is no hope that we could ever follow Jesus. But I wonder if somewhere between these there might be a better approach. Is there something that's more hopeful than Tolstoy's tormented relationship with God? And is there something more hopeful than Luther's defeatist acceptance of the wretched man? And I hope as we go through Jesus' parable this morning, we will find that there is, in fact, a pathway forward, that we can be transformed by following Jesus' teaching. So our parable this morning, we find it in Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 46. It's at the conclusion of what is known again either as the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, depending whether you're reading Matthew or Luke. And we're going to be reading Luke this morning. And Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you?" Now, everybody listening to this sermon has two things in common. Luke chapter 6, verse 18 tells us that they had come to hear him. And so what we recognize is that everybody has done part 1 and part 2 of what Jesus has talked about. They have come and they are now hearing. And we will find out that there are people who have come from as far north as Sidon, which if Jesus is teaching in Galilee, it's probably 60 miles north. They've traveled in an effort to come and to hear him. There are people who have come from Jerusalem 60 miles south of Galilee. And so you have this great investment of effort to go out to find Jesus, to track him down, and to listen to him. These are people who are passionate about the words and the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus seems to insinuate that it would be ridiculous that somebody would travel all of this way to hear his teaching and not do what he's calling them to do. Why would they invest all of that simply in the hearing process, but not the living process? See, in the Gospels, there's a reoccurring theme or question that people seem to keep asking about Jesus, and that question is, who is Jesus? And each time Jesus teaches something, it gives us almost breadcrumbs, clues that help us to begin to figure out exactly who Jesus is. Because there is a recognition that the identity of Jesus is one that demands a response. And so in this text, Jesus begins by talking about certain people who are blessed. And then he begins by talking about certain people who experience woe. And what's unique about the identity of Jesus is that the Old Testament has already given us a list of who's blessed and who's cursed. That's Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. And now Jesus is taking what God has said about who's blessed and cursed, and Jesus is extending the borders of who's blessed and cursed. And so if you're listening to Jesus, and he says that, or even after he says that, he'll say in verse 26, it says, "But I tell you." Now, any rabbi who's worth their salt is going to begin their preaching with what phrase? As the Torah tells you. It's kind of like any Christian. If I got up and I said, you know what, guys, we're not going to do Bible study this morning. I'm just going to tell you what you need to do to get to heaven. I would hope you wouldn't want to listen to me. But that's the very thing Jesus does in this sermon. He claims authority that's equal to God in saying, I can determine who will be blessed, and I can also determine who will be cursed. Jesus is sharing something about his lordship. And so those who have traveled this long distance, who have come to hear Jesus, some of them will identify Jesus as Lord. They will recognize his identity. But Jesus says, why would you call me Lord, Lord, but then not do what I tell you to do? If you've ever seen The Princess Bride, there's a character called Vizzini, and he has this word he repeats throughout, inconceivable. And what Jesus is saying, the idea that somebody would call him Lord, Lord, and not do what he says, that is inconceivable. Because the term Lord is one that not only does it identify who Jesus is, but it identifies who we are in response to or in relationship to Jesus. See, if he is Lord, that means that there are implications for who I am, and there's also implications for how I ought to live in allegiance to him. So another example of a term that we might have like that today is the word boss. If someone walks into the office and they introduce themselves and say, I'm your new boss, not only are they saying something about their identity, but they're also saying something about what? Your identity also. And your behavior towards them and your allegiance to them. That if they are boss, that means I am the employee. And if they are boss, that means what they say goes. And so Lord is one of those titles that it's not just simply a title of description, but it's a title with obligation. And so how can somebody say Lord, Lord, and not do what they say? They must either misunderstand what it means to be Lord, or they must misunderstand what it means for me to be a servant of that very Lord. And so Jesus tries to illustrate how inconceivable this would be, that somebody would call him Lord, Lord, and not do what he calls them to do, and he does so by a parable. And so this is the parable that Jesus teaches beginning in verse 47. I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. In the very first sermon I did on this series of parables, I mentioned that parable is a very broad term. There's all different types and categories, subcategories of parables. This parable is in the form of a simile. A simile being that thing that you say like or as. It's a point of comparison to something. But there is some discussion in this parable about whether it's just a simple simile or whether it's a simile that has allegorical features. An allegory, of course, is something that points to something else. The elements mean something else. And so it is important in terms of interpretation which way you go with this. So I'll take as an example a well-known, at least I think it'll be a well-known simile. See if you can finish this statement. Life is like a box of chocolates, right? Forrest Gump. And he goes on to say that means what? You never know what you're going to get. Now, that's a simple simile, which means the simile just has a single meaning. What we don't have to do with that simile is say, so I wonder what the box represents. Oh, I think that the box represents those people who are mean to you. And I wonder what the chocolate represents. The chocolate represents this, this, and this. A simple simile doesn't need to represent anything else. It, in a whole, represents something else. Now, I'm not going to tell you which way you need to read this parable, but you do need to make that decision, because if you start making allegorical connections, you have to be able to justify why the chocolate means the chocolate and the box means the box, if Jesus intended this as a simple simile. But Jesus' goal, it seems, throughout this parable is to help highlight how silly it would be to do something in one realm of life, and then how much sillier it would be to do that same thing in a much more important realm of life. Jesus takes this picture of building and he begins to make it look like a kind of a life that we live. Now, as we read this parable, the key is going to be for us to follow the verbs. If you follow the action and the verbs in this parable, you're going to know exactly where to go. I mean, all of the hand markings are there. But if you lose track of the verbs, I think you lose track of what Jesus is teaching. So in the very first verse, verse 47, as Jesus begins, we have three verbs that shout for our attention. Don't miss these three verbs. There is coming, there is hearing, and there is doing. And I've already told you in chapter 6, verse 18, everybody who's listening has done the first two. They have come and they have heard. But what remains to be seen is, will they do what he says? And that depends on their identity of him as Lord. Will they recognize him as such, and will they respond to him as such? And so they come. Those who come, they are likened to another activity told in a verbal form of one who is building. So these who come and hear and do, they are like a man who is doing something, and the thing that man is doing is he is building. And three verbs, comes across as two in English, but three verbs describe what the man did. He dug, he went down deep, and he laid a foundation. And this would be hard, laborious work. I want you to imagine that man's son is watching dad do that hard work of digging down deep, laying the foundation. And the kid says, Dad, that looks like hard work. And dad says, yeah, it is hard work. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. And so his son said, then Dad, why would you keep doing all of this hard work? And he says, because at some point this house is going to encounter the forces of nature. I don't know what force of nature it will be. I don't know whether it's going to be a flood or a windstorm or an earthquake, but it's going to, and the amount of effort I put into building this house is going to determine whether this house will sustain the amount of effort nature is going to be putting into its destruction. He's trying to get his son to see the value of doing the hard work in the building process. And not surprisingly, the attention shifts now from the builder's action to now the action of nature itself. Nature does, in fact, comes in the form of a flood, and that flood does something as a river. It bursts against the house. But what happens is highlighted again by the verbs. It was not able to, and it could not shake the house. So you have these forces competing against each other, and in this case, because the house was well built, it withstood the assault of nature. But let's move now to the second person. This is a person who also hears. Interestingly, though, in verse 49, the verb is in past tense. What the first man did, it was actually hear in the sense that it's actually an ongoing action. Best way to translate the first sense is that he was hearing. Still an ongoing. Now, this person has heard. Now, have you ever been in a context where you were hearing and then you went to heard, like you shut off what was being said? Maybe you've sat in a sermon, hopefully not one of mine, where the preacher's saying all sorts of weird and crazy things and you're hearing and then you're thinking, you know what? I don't buy it. I'm not listening anymore. I'm going to keep sitting here, but I'm done hearing. So that's what this second person has done. They came to hear Jesus teach. They were listening, and at some point they said, okay, this guy's crazy talk. They are no longer hearing. And what this second person does is there's a verbal action for him also. The verb is that he built, but again, that word built now is in past tense. He's already completed his house, which is, I think, to give us this sense like, wow, that was really fast. So imagine that kid who was watching his dad do all the hard work, and now the kid who's already in the house enjoying the air conditioning and the Diet Coke because his dad finished his house way faster. And he's like, Dad, look at that neighbor. He's still out there sweating away, and we're enjoying the house. Dad, you're so much smarter than that guy who's wasting all his hard work on things that don't even matter. And maybe the first guy finishes his house a month later, and you look at both those houses and you say, they look pretty much the same, don't they? Man, isn't it smarter to do less work? To take shortcuts? I mean, this guy is a genius. He does hardly nothing. In fact, so he is building the house, but the words that describe his building of the house, there are no verbs. He laid it on the ground. There was no foundation. And none of those words in the Greek are in a verbal tense. But what we need to realize is that what this man does is inconceivable in that culture. So that every parable has this moment of surprise, like, what are you doing? And this is that moment. See, I think it's important for us to realize that Jerusalem and London get the same amount of average annual rainfall, 22 inches every year. Here's the difference. In London, it rains an average of 300 days a year. In Jerusalem, it rains an average of 50 days a year. So maybe that's where the phrase came from. When it rains, it pours. If you live in Jerusalem, that's the case. And with that dry, arid ground, when the rain comes down, it's not going to suck into the ground because it's so hardened, it's going to create a riverbed. And so anybody living in that culture says, look, if you're going to build a house with the way that the rains work, you're going to spend the hard work and build the foundation. And to not do that, you would be a fool. Now, we don't live in a dry, arid place that gets these larger rainfalls, and so maybe it's hard for us to experience that foolishness. So I'm going to give you a story so you can experience what I think they were supposed to experience. There's a guy named Larry Walters, and Larry had always wanted to be a pilot, joined the Air Force. Unfortunately, his eyes weren't very good, so he never got to be a pilot. He was eventually discharged from the Air Force. Lived in Los Angeles, and he decided what he was going to do was he went to the Army surplus store, and he bought 45 8-foot-wide weather balloons. And he went home, sat down in his lawn chair, and he tied his lawn chair to his Jeep, and he tied the 45 balloons to his lawn chair, and he started filling them with helium. A few hours later, he's there being held up by the string above the ground. He has in his lap everything he thinks he needs. He's got a sandwich, he's got a BB gun, and he's got a Miller Lite. And his intention is he's going to have his friend cut the rope. He's going to float to about 30 feet. He's going to enjoy the sights, and then he's going to shoot down the balloons with his BB gun. When he's ready, friend cuts the rope. Guess what happens? Like a torpedo, he shoots up into the sky, ends up at 16,000 feet. He's so high up, he's paralyzed by fear. He can't shoot any of the balloons with the BB gun until 14 hours into the process, he gets enough courage to do it. And on the way back down, he crosses the airspace in Los Angeles airport, and he's greeted by police. That's a pretty foolish thing to do. And that's how Jesus wants us to think about this second builder who would not dig deeply, and would not lay his foundation. Because everybody knows that once nature has its way with a house, it's not going to withstand it. And so, of course, the verbal action of nature comes. It bursts towards the house, and immediately the house has a great ruin. I mean, there's no shaking because there's nothing to shake because it was so fast and it was so immediate, the destruction for it. See, I think what Jesus is doing at the end of his sermon is saying, I expect you to do what I'm telling you to do. And to not do it would be as foolish as this story that I've just told you. See, for Jesus, he is calling for an active, verb-plastered response for those who would affirm his identity as Lord. You cannot call him Lord and not expect there to be work involved in your relationship with him. Now, specifically, I think what Jesus is referring to here is the things he's mentioned in the sermon: loving your neighbors, doing good to those who hate you, blessing and praying for your enemies, turning to the other cheek, giving your garment, giving your alms. And yet, without a doubt, there is an expectation that those who follow Jesus will work with their effort and labor in that process. But now we're Christians in 2020, living in Billings, Montana, and we've had this discussion that's been ongoing for several centuries. It's called faith versus works. It's interesting, the person who gets in the way most of the faith versus work discussion is a guy named Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Kind of the founder of faith, we're like, we don't know where to fit this guy in this great equation that we've worked. So I want us to unpack a little bit how this parable might work in conjunction with or help us understand faith versus works. And I have two main points I want to make about this. The first is that you cannot do what Jesus teaches without first knowing Jesus' identity and thereby experiencing the grace of God. You have to first experience God's grace. Now, sometimes we think about faith and works like dueling or feuding divorced parents. I know a couple that when they were planning their wedding, everything seemed to be going well until the future bride's mother called and said, if Dad shows up at the wedding, I'm not coming. Boy, that put them in quite a predicament, didn't it? Sometimes we think faith and works is that way. You know, faith says, if works is coming to the wedding, I don't want anything to do with works. Or works says, okay, well, if grace is going to the wedding or faith is going to the wedding, I'm not going to go. But we need to begin to see these two things like married parents who want what's best for their children. That they're not opposite to each other or incompatible with each other. In fact, in their working together, they do the work that God is calling his people to do. See, when I think about the relationship between grace and works and faith and works, I think about maybe an experience at your favorite restaurant where what matters is the order, not so much the events. I mean, imagine you go into your favorite restaurant and the first thing they do is they bring you a bill. $120? You don't even know what I'm going to order, and you're charging me already for it? That would make me mad because there's an order. I order, then you give me the bill for what I order. Grace and works is the very same sort of thing, is that we have to make sure we know which one goes first. We enter into a relationship based on the gracious work of Jesus Christ. That's how this sermon begins. We may have missed it because we're so used to this, but Jesus begins by saying, blessed are the poor, the needy, the left. Like if you're in that category, nobody ever thought you should, using last week's sermon, ever be invited to a party. And just, hey, I invite you. I welcome you. You are a blessed person. And if you've never been invited to anything or never been blessed because you just were always left out of it, you think this is pretty amazing stuff. Grace precedes everything. But in the very sermon that begins in grace, how does it end? It ends with this kind of canon of a warning that if you do not do what I do, that is silly or that is foolish. See, what does grace expect us to do with the wretch in the mirror? I think that what God wants is for us to transform into a new creation. That's God's longing and desire. God doesn't want us to get used to the wretch in the mirror. That God's ultimate desire is that every time we see the wretch in the mirror, we say, well, this is who I am. This is who I'll always be. God wants transformation, and that transformation is based in God's initial gracious action, but then it's also based in our active verbal response. So I think that's the second part of what I want to emphasize from this parable, is that without diligent effort, grounded of course in His grace, you cannot do what Jesus teaches. It's not antithetical for us as Christians to say, sometimes we're going to have to sweat a little bit. Sometimes we're going to have to wake up early a little bit. Sometimes we're going to have to work late a little bit. But His grace will also allow us to do what we can and to rely on God to do what we cannot. Part of the problem that people get into is that they try to do things that God never intended them to do. But God will enable us to do what He calls us to do. I've shared this quote before, but I think it's important to be reminded. This is a Dallas Willard quote. Grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Earning is an attitude. Effort is an action. And I think that bears true as you read this parable. Jesus is not saying at the very end of the parable, now if you've heard what I say, accept it, and then accept yourself, and that's all you need to do. There is a calling and a response that Jesus is calling people to. And we need to be prepared to do the kind of work that Jesus calls us to. So, over the last 2 weekends, my wife and I have been replacing the gutters at our house. You say, last 2 weekends? That sounds like a one-weekend job. Well, probably it should be. Unless you're as talented as we are, you can do it in 2 weekends. But it took a lot of some of the things that we find pretty precious. Took some of the resources out of our pocketbook to do it. Took an awful lot of time, probably more than it should have, to do it. Took a lot of energy, at least from Jerry. She was the one who had hold it up, and I just kind of, stood up there with my screwdriver trying to get things to work. But I think what Jesus is saying is, hey, Craig, you put a lot of work into protecting the foundation of your house. That's the only reason we did it. I mean, it's not to look pretty. It's to make sure the water doesn't get in. And I think what Jesus says, Craig, you did that 2 Saturdays of your precious time. Would you really protect that foundation and not care for your foundation in your relationship with Christ? Craig, are you willing to take the time, the effort, the energy, and the commitment to building something that will protect your foundation in your relationship with God? And by the end of the sermon, Jesus is hoping all of us would say, of course. Tell me what to do. Show me, guide me, enable me, empower me, and I will do what you call me to do. And so my encouragement to you is to then make that commitment yourself. Jesus is calling all of us to respond. Our responses are very different based on where we are in life. Maybe you've never called Him Lord. That would be your first step. Lord, Lord. Submit to Him in baptism. Acknowledge Him as your Savior. But then beyond that, if He is your Lord, it's reevaluating constantly, am I giving my time, my effort, my energy in service of Him so that I can become a new creation? May the Lord bless you and keep you.